We often think of democracy as this finished thing, right? Like, it's the system we ended up with. But what if it's not a final product at all? What if it's actually this messy, powerful, and constantly changing idea? A journey that started thousands of years ago and, well, is still very much in progress. Let's dive into the story of how this powerful idea kind of accidentally changed the whole world. And right from the very beginning, in the exact place democracy was born, its biggest fans were also its biggest critics. I mean, listen to this from Socrates. He's pointing to this central nagging question: is letting everybody have a say really the smartest way to run things? And that tension, that push and pull between the power of the people and the risk of total chaos, that's really the core conflict in the entire story of democracy. And believe it or not, Socrates' ancient worry is incredibly relevant today. I mean, just look at this poll. In dozens of democracies, a majority of people feel like the system just isn't working for them anymore. So this isn't some dusty old philosophical debate. It's a real, widespread feeling. And to figure out why, we've got to go back. Way back. Okay, so let's start with the first big democratic experiment in ancient Athens. Here's the thing. It wasn't born from some grand, noble vision. Nope. It was actually a practical, almost accidental fix for a century of brutal civil war and class conflict. The Athenians, they loved a good story. And their version of how democracy started was this heroic myth. Brave heroes, an evil tyrant overthrown, and boom, freedom. But the reality? Oh, it was so much messier. It was this winding, century-long process of arguments, reforms, and painful compromises, all basically designed to stop the rich and powerful from tearing the city apart. And out of that whole process, they created something totally new: democratia. The word literally means people power. But the real game changer was this idea of isonomia, equality for all under the law. And think about how radical that is. It means the law is king, not any single person. It kind of brings the folks at the top down a peg and lifts the folks at the bottom up. And the way they participated was just wild. Citizens would literally show up in person to vote on laws. And get this, many officials were chosen by a random lottery just to keep corruption down. But this brings up a huge question. Who actually counted as the people? Well, the Athenian definition was incredibly small. Women, slaves, foreigners, the huge majority of the population were totally cut out of the deal. So, after Athens fell, democracy basically just vanished. It became this forgotten idea, almost a cautionary tale. So how on earth did this ancient experiment get pieced back together to become the blueprint for our modern world? Okay, get a load of this number. For 2,000 years, the idea of rule by the people was basically off the table. It wasn't just forgotten, people actively avoided it. They saw it as this unstable, dangerous experiment that just led to chaos. The comeback was slow. I mean, really slow. It was a gradual layering of ideas over centuries. It started with things like the Magna Carta, which set up the idea that even a king has to follow the law. Then you had the intellectual firepower of the Enlightenment. And all of that slowly paved the way for the American Revolution to finally put it all into practice. The Enlightenment basically provided the toolkit for modern democracy. You had thinkers like John Locke, who gave us the idea that a government is only legit if it has the consent of the governed. Then you had Montesquieu arguing for separating powers to create checks and balances. And Rousseau championed popular sovereignty, this idea that the ultimate power belongs to the people. These weren't just abstract thoughts, they were literally blueprints for a revolution. And so, those blueprints were finally put to the test. But the founders of new nations like the United States weren't just inspired by the past, they were also deeply afraid of it, especially the pure, direct democracy of ancient Athens. And you can see that difference so clearly right here. The American founders deliberately built a republic, not a direct democracy. So instead of citizens voting on every single law, they elected representatives to do it for them. And this is crucial. Unlike in Athens, where the majority's will was absolute, they limited that power with a constitution. It was designed to protect individual rights from the majority. This was their answer to the problem of mob rule. I mean, this quote from James Madison just sums up their fears perfectly. The founders looked back at the history of Athens, and they saw chaos, mob rule, and self-destruction. They truly believed a pure democracy was a recipe for disaster. Their goal was to harness the people's power while taming its most dangerous side. But this new model created its own fundamental question, one that echoes all the way back to Athens. If power comes from the people, then who exactly gets to be the people? And that question would define the next 2 centuries of democracy's evolution. In the early days of the American experiment, the answer was, well, it's pretty shocking. The only people who could vote were white, property-owning men, and that added up to only about 6% of the population. A staggering 94% of people were left out of We the People. Just let that sink in. So, the history of modern democracy really is the story of the fight to make that tiny circle bigger. It was one hard-fought battle after another. Getting rid of property requirements, the Civil War and the 15th Amendment, the long struggle for women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment, and of course the Civil Rights Movement, which led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the result of all that struggle is profound. Just compare that first chart from 1790 to this one today. The circle of the people has expanded to include pretty much every adult citizen. This is maybe the single greatest evolution in the whole story of democracy, a story of inclusion won through generations of struggle. So this brings us right back to where we started, that feeling that democracy is messy, that it's full of conflict, and maybe that it's even broken. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if its biggest perceived weakness is actually its defining feature? I love this quote from the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. He said, "Democracy is a constant public argument." It completely reframes the whole idea. The fighting, the debating, the disagreeing, that isn't a sign that the system is failing. That is the system working exactly as it's supposed to. And man, that argument is intense today. We're dealing with huge challenges, right? Rising polarization, disinformation spreading like wildfire, threats to our institutions. All of this is testing democratic systems everywhere. And it's making a lot of us wonder if the whole thing can even hold together. But when you understand this long evolutionary history, it gives you a different perspective. The story of democracy has never been a story of calm or perfection. It's always been a story of crisis, conflict, and then reform. Its genius isn't that it's flawless. Its genius is that it's the only system designed with a built-in capacity to fix itself. It's designed to be argued with, to be challenged, and to be made better. So, the journey isn't over. The story is definitely not finished. In fact, the very struggles and arguments that worry us so much today are the engine of democracy's next evolution. Which leaves us with a final question. If democracy is always a work in progress, what is our role in writing its next chapter?